Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
Långernåt, langer och tvär, way of thröjak thriar. Oft mer manather minni thoti en sja halv hynod. I've just recited the final stanza to a poem in the Poetic Edda called Skirnismol. It means, long is one night, long are two. How shall I long through three? Often a month to me has seemed less than half of one of these wedding eves. It sounds a little bit like a love poem, and in a way it is, portraying a man's eagerness to be married to the love of his life. But once you hear the context, it may lose a bit of its sweetness. According to ancient Norse belief, someday in the not-too-distant future, there will be an enormous world-ending battle between the gods and the Jotnar. Unfortunately, the gods are fated to lose this battle, which means nearly all of humanity will be destroyed as a consequence. But in order for the gods to lose, very specific circumstances have to first be put in place. Odin and Thor, for example, are fated to die while fighting two of Loki's monstrous children. Had Loki never fathered those children, Ragnarök might have become a relatively easy win for the gods. After all, we've seen Thor single-handedly demolish an entire army of Jotnar once before, at the end of the poem Hymiskvida. But Thor isn't the only hero of the Norse corpus. He gets the most airtime in the surviving myths, sure. But there's another extremely important character who has performed his own share of epic deeds in the past. Specifically, I'm talking about Njordr's son, Freyr. In order for the gods to lose at Ragnarök, Freyr also has to be removed from play. And it so happens that in today's story, Freyr will make a decision that ultimately seals his own fate in that regard. But before we get into it, let's talk about what we know about Freyr. Snorri tells us in the Prose Edda that Freyr is the brother of Freya, and stanza 32 of the poem Lokasenna adds that the two of them have had some incestuous relations in the past. But in the same poem, the god Tyr delivers some high praise for Freyr, telling us in stanza 37, quote, "Freyr is the best of all the bold riders in the courts of the Aesir. He makes no girl cry, nor any man's wife, and looses each man from captivity," end quote. Back in the Prose Edda, Snorri calls Freyr the most glorious of the Aesir, ruling over the wealth of men. He also rules over sunshine, rain, and by extension, crops. Something a little more curious about Freyr is that he often shows up in what looks like a ruling trio with both Odin and Thor. In the story about the creation of Mjolnir, Odin, Thor, and Freyr are the three judges who determine which items made by the dwarves are the best. There's also the famous quote by Adam of Bremen in the 11th century that I've brought up a few times in the past that describes a pagan temple in Uppsala, Sweden as housing three idols of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. And in the poem Skirnismol, which we'll be digging into today, a trio of Odin, Thor, and Freyr are named as part of a magical curse. Snorri, who you'll recall was an Icelandic chieftain, heavily associates Freyr with Sweden. In his Ynglinga saga, which I will never stop reminding you is a largely fake history book inspired by Norse mythology, Freyr is portrayed as a Swedish king who takes the throne after Odin and Njordr. When he dies, the Swedes continue to make offerings to him, and as long as they do so, they are able to maintain peace and prosperity. But even though Ynglinga saga isn't very useful as an accurate history, there is other evidence that supports a tight association between Freyr and Sweden. In 2007, Stefan Brink wrote a paper documenting the geographic variation in worship of the different gods as it shows up in place names. So, in other words, if we find a particular region in Scandinavia with lots of old places named after god number 1 and no places named after god number 2, but then in another region there are a bunch of places named after god number 2 but not many named after god number 1, then it's theoretically a pretty good indication of how important ritual worship was of those two gods in those two different regions. For instance, almost all places named after the god Tyr exist in Denmark, with almost nothing in the Scandinavian peninsula. Place names related to Freyr, however, are just the opposite.
There are many in the Scandinavian peninsula, with almost nothing in Denmark. On the peninsula, although there are a good number of Freyr-derived place names in the area of modern Norway, about half of them are near the Swedish border, and there are also about 72% more of them actually in Sweden. Terry Gunnell notes as well that in the Icelandic sources, a priest of Freyr is often called a Freysgoði, but there is a curious absence of words like Thorsgoði or Odhinsgoði, which we might expect to see in reference to priests devoted to other gods. Instead, we usually just get the more basic Goði. Gunnell suggests that this is because Freyr worship and cults of Freyr were outside the cultural norm for Iceland. You can imagine it sort of like if there was a large Catholic community that suddenly had a small Anglican population move into the area. Traditionally, the people living in this area probably referred to their local Catholic priest as simply the priest. But because these new Anglicans are religious outsiders in this context, most people will refer to their priest as the Anglican priest. The specificity denotes some amount of otherness. Gunnell also points out some otherness in the way Danish author Saxo Grammaticus discusses his account of the character Starkother spending time with a group called the Sons of Freyr in Sweden. Saxo notes that Starkother is disgusted by their, quote, womanish body movements, the clatter of actors on the stage, and the soft tinkling of bells, end quote. So the literary evidence from Iceland and Denmark both seem to support Brink's place name evidence, showing that although Freyr was clearly understood to be an important god throughout the north, his cult was most prominent in the central and eastern parts of the Scandinavian peninsula, and may have been considered a cultural minority in the west, where the Eddas were written. Freyr is also named by Snorri as one of the Vanir deities, so it's possible that if our robust mythological sources had come from Sweden instead of Iceland, we might have a much better understanding of what this ambiguous word Vanir actually means, and a whole lot more stories about Freyr and maybe even Freya as well. On that note, I've mentioned before that the words Freyr and Freya are actually titles, meaning lord and lady. In the case of Freyr, we actually have some information about the name that goes along with the title. In Skaldskaparmál 75, also called the Navnathulur, Freyr is called Yngvi Freyr, or in other words, Lord Yngvi, twice. A similar name also shows up in Haustlong, which you may recall is the poem that serves as our source for the stories about the kidnapping of Idun and about Thor's battle with Hrungnir. In Haustlong, the Aesir are referred to by a kenning calling them the kin of Yngi Freyr, which looks like it may just be a variation of the same name Yngvi. In the Poetic Edda, stanza 43 of Lokasenna has Freyr's servant Bygvir referring to him as Ingunar Freyr, which Lindow explains looks like a West Germanic form of the same name. In fact, some form of this Yngvi name is super old and shows up all over the Germanic record. Snorri's Ynglinga saga is so named because it ostensibly establishes the origin of a Scandinavian dynasty called the Ynglings, who are said to be the descendants of Yngvi Freyr. Outside of Scandinavia, variations on this name show up in places like Beowulf and in other Old English literature where we get references to characters like Ing and Ingeld and Yngwi Freya. Going back to Germania by Tacitus once again, we get this little nugget about the beliefs of the Proto-Germanic people. Quote, in their old ballads, which amongst them are the only sort of registers in history, they celebrate Tuisto, a god sprung from the earth, and Manus, his son, as the fathers and founders of the nation. To Manus they assign 3 sons, after whose names so many people are called, the Ingavones, dwelling next to the ocean, the Hermanones, in the middle country, and all the rest Istavones. End quote. So here again, we see this idea of a people being descended from a god with an Ing-related name, similar to what Snorri describes. But apart from being the progenitor of a dynasty, Freyr is also the ruler of a place called Alfheimr, according to Grimnismal stanza 5, which means home or realm of the elves, and which was given to him as a gift for cutting his first tooth as a child. Freyr's youth is referenced one other time in the poem Skirnismal, and Larrington notes that he is actually the only god who seems to have had a childhood. I would personally use weaker phrasing and say something more like, he is the only god whose childhood is ever referenced. But it's interesting that 2 poems reference Freyr's childhood, whereas no sources reference the childhood of any of the other gods.
It makes me suspect that there may be something unique going on here, but it's hard to say what exactly that might be. Of course, no Norse god is complete without at least one special magic item. Thor has his hammer Mjolnir, Odin has his spear Gungnir, and the golden arm ring Draupnir that produces 8 more gold rings every 9 nights. Freyr has a golden bristled boar named Gulenbursti that he either rides or who pulls him in a chariot or wagon, as well as the ship Skidbladnir that always has a fair wind and can be folded up to fit in his pocket. But as our story begins today, Freyr is also in possession of a third magical item, a sword, which strangely doesn't have a name as far as we know. But what makes this sword magical is that, according to Skirnismal stanza 9, it, quote, will fight by itself if he who wields it is wise, end quote. For those of you who are accustomed to stories and games that feature magic swords, I don't get the impression that this sword is necessarily intended to be thinking or sentient in any way, just that whereas your average sword requires a great deal of practice and skill in order to be used effectively, Freyr's sword will just magically be able to make effective strikes and parries if its wielder is wise, which again could mean knowledgeable, intelligent, or actually wise. We don't get a physical description of this sword, but if this is an old idea, and if it matches the other descriptions of old magic swords in the Norse sources, we might expect it to look like a very fancy version of a Germanic migration-era sword, all decked with gold, and specifically decorated with a small finger-sized ring probably affixed to the pommel. Podcasts aren't really a great medium for talking about what things look like, obviously, but if you've ever seen Robert Eggers' The Northman, the sword Amleth finds in the burial chamber is very much in this style, minus the runes they carved onto the blade for the movie. In the sources, the hero Sigurdur's magic sword Gramr is described as ring-hilted in Sigurdarkvida in Skama, and in Helgakvida Hjörvarðssonar, a Valkyrie tells the hero Helgi where he can find a sword that has, quote, courage in the middle and terror in its point, end quote. She describes it as having a blood-dyed snake design along the edge, and again, a ring in the hilt. So there's definitely a pattern to how these old magic swords tend to look, which is why I imagine Freyr's sword as likely conforming to this pattern. Now, as we've mentioned before, Odin is not omniscient and omnipresent. He has various means of learning about all things going on in the world, one of which is that he has ravens who travel abroad and bring news back to him. But another is that his throne, called Hlidskjolf, is positioned somewhere that allows him to look out from there and see across all the world. It's an idea that seems to be reflected in the legendary origins of the Germanic Langobards, often called Lombards. Their founding myth is contained in a 7th century Latin manuscript called Origo Gentis Langobardorum, and the short version of the story is that the goddess Frigg, who funnily enough is called Freya here in Latin, although linguistically it's different from Old Norse Freya, decides to help a group of people called the Winneli prevail in battle against the Vandals. Odin, who the text calls Godan, has already promised victory to whoever he sees first at sunrise. So Frigg, or Freya, as she's called here, tells the Winneli to have their women tie their hair around their faces so that it looks like they have beards, and to have them march in the army with the men. Then, as the sun begins to rise, Freya turns Godan's bed towards the east and wakes him up, ensuring that he sees the Winneli women first. And sure enough, the first thing Odin says when he wakes up is, "Who are these Longbeards?" Freyr responds by saying, "As you have given them a name, give them also the victory." And he does. And ever since then, they have been known as Longbeards, Langobards. The point I want to make with this story is to illustrate that another Germanic group outside of Scandinavia, and before the beginning of the Viking Age, had a concept that Odin can position himself in a place that allows him to rotate around and see across the world in different directions. There's also some fun stuff here with Odin being associated with the sun and stuff, but all that is best left for another time. But this is Hlidskjolf, and as our story begins today, Odin is not the one seated in Hlidskjolf looking out across the world, but instead we find Freyr there looking out into Jotunheimr, and noticing a beautiful girl walking between her father's hall and some other outbuilding. Freyr is immediately knocked head over heels for this girl in a way the intro to Skirnismal describes as him catching, quote, great sickness of heart, end quote.
In the Prose Edda, Snorri gives a somewhat abridged account of this same story, and in that version, he describes this great sickness of heart as though it was something like karma. Specifically, he calls it a punishment for Freyr's great presumption of having sat in that holy seat. But to be fair, it's hard to know if this is Snorri's own interpretation or whether it was a common pagan idea. Either way, Freyr comes away from Odin's throne acting like a mopey, lovesick teenager. And given that he's a god who is generally believed to have had a childhood, who knows? Maybe a young version is exactly the version of Freyr we're being given in this story. In any case, he's not talking to anybody and he's not sleeping or drinking, just generally acting very depressed. So Njordur and Skadi turn to Freyr's Skolswain, which literally means like shoe boy, in other words, something like a servant or a page boy, and they ask him to go figure out what's wrong with their son. So Skirnir goes to Freyr and he says, "Tell me, Freyr, why are you just sitting alone in the long hall day after day?" And Freyr replies, "Why should I tell you about my sorrows, huh? Day after day the sun shines, but not according to my desires." "Well, I don't think your desires are so great that you couldn't tell me what they are," Skirnir presses. "You and I basically grew up together and trust each other pretty well as far as I'm concerned." So then Freyr gives in and explains his deep and brooding sorrows. Quote, "In Gymir's courts I saw walking a girl pleasing to me. Her arms shine, and from them all the sea and air catch light. More pleasing to me is the girl than any girl to any young man in bygone days. Of all the gods and the elves, no one wishes that we should be together." End quote. I always love the way ancient poetry expresses attractiveness. In this case, the girl's best feature is how shiny her arms are. I suppose high school dress codes must be designed with boys like Freyr in mind. If this is the way he responds to seeing some shiny arms, who knows what he might do if he ever caught a glimpse of a shoulder. Anyway, Skirnir appears to be a somewhat opportunistic fellow, and he sees this as an opportunity to both help out a friend in need and also to score some pretty sweet loot. So he says to Freyr, "Tell you what, I can make this happen for you, and all I need you to give me is a horse. And also your super awesome famous magic sword that fights all by itself." And at this point, Freyr probably would have given up anything in the world to be with his one true love, who he seems to have never actually met in person, so he readily agrees. So by now it's dark outside, and Skirnir takes the horse and the sword and expresses a little bit of worry about being seized by some all-powerful Jotun, presumably Gymir, the father of Freyr's newly unrequited love, and then sets off on his journey, taking him over a dewy mountain and through the realms of the Jotnar. We get a prose interjection in the poem here that fast-forwards us just a little way through the story and finally gives us the name of this girl that Freyr is pining over, Gerður. We're told that Skirnir rides through Jotunheimr and into the courts of Gymir, where he finds savage dogs tied in front of the gate in a wooden fence surrounding Gerður's hall, which are preventing him from going inside. So he rides to where a herdsman of some sort is sitting on a nearby mound, and the poetry resumes with Skirnir asking the herdsman how he can get past the dogs to have a conversation with Gerður. The herdsman replies that Skirnir must either be doomed or dead already if his goal is to try and get an audience with Gerður. It's just never going to happen. But Skirnir appeals to fate in the way a proper Norse man should, and explains that dying is better than just sitting around crying about not being able to attain your goals. "For on one day," he says, "all my lifespan was shaped, all my days laid down." In other words, if I'm going to die today, that's my fate, and there's nothing I can do about it, whether I try to have this conversation with Gerður or not. So I'm going to try. Now the scene changes to the inside of Gerður's hall, where Gerður starts hearing some huge commotion outside. "What is that noise of noises which I hear now, making a noise in our dwellings?" she asks her unnamed serving maid. "The earth trembles, and all Gymir's courts shudder before it." The maid replies that there's a man outside, letting his horse graze in the yard, and Gerður instructs her to invite him in for a drink of mead, which she calls the famous mead. "Although," she adds, "I am afraid that out here may be my brother's slayer." Right here, we get hit with some ambiguity, because we don't know exactly who Gerður's brother is. The commotion she's just heard outside would otherwise be pretty easily interpreted as the sound of Skirnir overcoming the dogs at the gate. But now there's an idea that a brother has died as well. Larrington theorizes that in some version of the story, the herdsman on the mound may have been Gerður's brother, whom Skirnir had to overcome alongside the dogs or possibly in lieu of the dogs, which makes pretty good sense to me since the herdsman is the only other character in the story that we've been introduced to at this point. But to be clear, we are never actually told who Gerðr's brother is and whether or not it really was Skirnir who kills him. Larrington also notes that in the poem Lokasenna, the goddess Idun is accused of embracing her brother's killer, and as we discussed in episode 13, we're about to see some apples enter the story here, so there has been some scholarly speculation about whether or not there is some connection between Idun and Gerðr. Skirnir presumably now enters the hall, and Gerðr asks him to introduce himself. Their exchange is interesting, so I'm going to quote it to you directly. Quote, "Who are you, of the elves, of the Aesir's sons, or of the wise Vanir? Why do you come alone over the wild fire to see our company?" Skirnir said, "I am not of the elves, or of the Aesir's sons, or of the wise Vanir, though I come alone over the wild fire to see your company." End quote. There are a couple of really fascinating points in that small bit of dialogue. One is that this poem Skirnismál seems to be drawing a pretty clean distinction between Aesir, Vanir, and elves as different categories of beings, which is an important key in the ongoing debate about whether or not we properly understand what the word Vanir means, and as we try to wrap our heads around what elves actually are. Skirnir himself claims to belong to none of these categories, making us wonder exactly what type of being he is in the capacity of Freyr's servant. Zemek would probably point out that although the poem does seem to separate Aesir from Vanir, it only mentions Vanir within the extremely common poetic phrase, wise Vanir, which services alliteration and seems to be an archaism preserved mainly in poetry, indicating that the author may not have understood the original meaning of the word. In any case, it's fun to think about. There's also this notion of Skirnir having come across some wild fire in order to reach his destination. Up to this point, the poem hasn't given us a description of him crossing any fires, and we don't have any descriptions of cosmology that include some wild fires separating locations from each other. The best theory I've heard for what this means is that, if you'll recall, Snorri tells us that the red we see in the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, or Bifrost, most commonly pronounced as Bifrost, is fire. So it's possible that Skirnir has ridden over Bifrost as part of his journey into Jotunheimr. But now that he is in Gerðr's hall, it's time to start trying to convince her to hook up with Freyr. So Skirnir begins with bribery. "I have here 11 apples made of gold," he says, "and I would like to give them to you as means of buying your favor for Freyr." But Gerðr scoffs at this. "I wouldn't sell myself for 11 apples to any man," she replies, "and I will never settle down with Freyr as long as I live." Seeing that the apples aren't payment enough, Skirnir attempts to sweeten the pot and actually tries to promise her Odin's magical arm ring Draupnir that drips out 8 more equally heavy golden rings every 9 nights. Surely he must be thinking if 11 golden apples aren't enough, then infinite gold ought to do the trick, right? But Gerðr rejects this offer as well, explaining that she already has no lack for gold in her father's courts. So now Skirnir decides he's going to dispense with the pleasantries. The poem takes a dark turn here as Skirnir shifts tactics from bribery to threats. He unsheathes his sword and says, "Do you see this sword in my hand? Give me what I want or I'll cut your head off with it." But Gerðr remains undeterred. "I'm not going to let you coerce me," she responds, "but if it's a fight you want, I can always call my father in here." "Nah," Skirnir continues, "this sword will kill your father too, and not only that, but I will also strike you with a magic wand and bend you to my will. I'll send you away where men will never see you again. You'll be confined to an eagle's mound, stuck there, looking out over the world wishing you could die, abhorring food. May you become a spectacle, stared at by everyone and everything as you stare back from behind the bars of your cage. May you go mad and howl and be tormented by tearing affliction and unbearable desire. May you cry tears of grief. And make sure you're sitting down for this part," and yes, Skirnir actually does say that, "because I'm about to really lay a curse of twofold grief and torment on you now. Your friends will oppress you all day long, and every day you will creep to the halls of the frost giants without freedom, or any hope of freedom, crying and full of misery, and you'll live out the remainder of your life with a 3-headed ogre, or otherwise have no man at all. May your spirit be seized, may pining waste you away,
Be like a thistle, which gets crushed at the end of the harvest. You know this curse is legit, too, because I went to the forest, and I got a magic stick from a sap-rich tree. Odin is angry with you, Thor is angry with you, and Freyr will hate you, you wicked girl. You've brought upon yourself the mighty wrath of the gods. Hear me now, O giants and frost ogres and sons of Suttungr and all the Aesir, how I forbid and deny any pleasure or benefit in men to this girl. A Jotun named Hrimgrimnir will possess you down below the corpse gates, where the only thing you'll ever have to drink is goat's piss. And now to seal this curse, watch me make some magic carvings. I'm carving the word Thors, and 3 other runes, lewdness and frenzy, and unbearable desire. But here's the thing, I can carve all this back off just as easily as I carved it on, if you give me a reason to undo the curse. Note that a full 10 out of the 42 total stanzas of this poem, so nearly a quarter of the whole thing, is dedicated to the curse that Skirnir levels against Gerður to get her to comply with his demands. And the problem, of course, for Gerður is that, as ridiculous as Skirnir's magic stick may sound to the modern ear, this is potential reality for her. And so, at this point, she finally relents and offers Skirnir a cup full of ancient mead, while explaining that she never thought she would ever come to love a member of the Vanir. Skirnir's curse is fascinating for the insight it gives us into how magic worked under certain circumstances among the Norse, and in particular, rune magic. Note all the components that go into Skirnir's curse in order to make it work. Firstly, he talks about striking her with what he actually calls a, quote, taming wand, and then he lays out his intentions for her suffering. He invokes a trio of gods' names. He calls for the attention of various groups of supernatural beings, presumably so that they will be aware of this curse. And then finally, he seals it all in writing by carving full words related to the intentions he's laid out, I assume, into the magic stick he got from the sap-rich tree in the forest. When we see rune magic described in the Norse sources, it tends to follow this pattern in that it's typically much more complicated than this modern idea that a single rune has some magical meaning that delivers some magical effect if you wear it as jewelry or carve it into something. Instead, there are typically many components to a spell, including certain recited formula and the carving of full words or very particular sequences of runes into certain objects. Also worthy of note is that the curse appears to be cancelable by scratching out the runes that were used to seal it. It's also interesting to note that Gerður uses the word Vanir again here as a reference to Freyr, although this time it facilitates alliteration with well instead of wise. Both words start with a V in Old Norse. So does the fact that she never thought she could love one of the Vanir mean she could have loved a member of the Aesir? Or, if these words mean the same thing as Zemek believes, does she simply mean she never would have thought she could love any type of god at all? Now that he's gotten agreement from Gerður through coercion and the threat of horrible abuse, all Skirnir needs is to know when Gerður will make herself available for a tryst with Freyr. Gerður determines that in 9 nights' time, she will hook up with Freyr at a grove called Barri, and then Skirnir rides back home to give the good news to his mopey friend. When he arrives, he finds Freyr waiting for him outside. In the same way that Thor demands news from Loki about his stolen hammer before Loki even has a chance to land and get settled in after his own excursion into Jotunheimr, Freyr starts demanding news from Skirnir before he has a chance to even remove the saddle from his horse. Skirnir responds that his quest has been successful, and that Gerður will agree to meet Freyr in Barri Grove in 9 nights' time. But in typical lovesick teenager fashion, Freyr responds with the verse that I quoted at the beginning of this episode. Long is 1 night, long are 2. How shall I long through 3? Often a month to me has seemed less than half of one of these wedding eves. What's interesting is that the language used to describe Gerður's meetup with Freyr in this poem seems to flip back and forth between sounding like a wedding and sounding like a one-night stand. But ultimately, the poem Hyndluljóð seems to imply that Gerður is Freyr's wife, and Snorri also names her as a member of the Aesir clan, which is something we would only really expect as the result of a marriage. However, there's also a moment in the Prose Edda where Snorri calls Frigg a rival of Gerður in the context of a whole bunch of women that Odin has slept with. So that sounds like a missing story I'm really disappointed we no longer have. On the subject of missing stories, when Snorri tells his version of this story in Gylfaginning, it's set into the conversation that Gangleri, a disguised Swedish king, is having with 3 wizards in a town named after Osgarður. The wizards explain that because Freyr had given away his magical sword in this instance, he was forced to use an antler from a stag as a weapon when he killed another Jotun called Beli. This particular battle is part of another story that no longer survives, but must have been pretty popular in the past since it gets referenced in small ways pretty frequently throughout the sources. Gangleri responds by noting how strange it would be for someone to give away such an amazing sword if they didn't have something just as good to fall back on. He mentions that this must have been a pretty severe handicap for Freyr in his fight against Beli, but the wizards disagree. Freyr could have killed Beli with an empty fist if he'd needed to, they assert. But, quote, there will come a time when Freyr will find being without the sword a greater disadvantage when Muspel's sons come and wage war, end quote. Just as Odin will be eaten by the wolf Fenrir, and Thor will be poisoned to death by the world serpent, Freyr will lose his fight to the Jotun Surtur, who has his own magical flaming sword. All because Freyr, in his short-sightedness, was willing to give up anything to be together with the girl with the shiniest arms. But even though this may be the worst love story of all time, there are plenty more horrible events to come. So stick with me as we continue inching ever closer towards Ragnarok on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Blótgyðjur, Goðar, Mimi, Incest, and Wagons, Oral Memories of the Religions of the Vanir by Terry Gunnell, 2017. How Uniform Was the Old Norse Religion by Stefan Brink, 2007. Norse Mythology, A Guide to the Gods, Heroes, Rituals, and Beliefs by John Lindow, 2001. Origo Gentis Langobardorum, 7th century. The Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014. And the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.